Good morning, everybody, and welcome again to the Arab Center, Washington, D.C.'s first annual conference. As you know, this conference is held in partnership with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Denver, at the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies. It's my pleasure to introduce our morning panel with 5 speakers. The panelists will focus on the Arab Spring and the troubled transition to democracy. My name is Nadim Rouhana. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., and Professor of International Affairs at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. This morning's panel will reflect on the state of democracy in the Arab world today, and the 5 speakers will address this in different ways. It's more than 5 years after what started as the Arab Spring, being troubled now, and the panel will discuss the various factors, regional and otherwise, that have contributed to the current state of affairs of the Arab Spring. In specific countries, some of the speakers, and in general, other speakers. So other speakers will also explore new avenues for reform in each of the various contexts. In the failed transition in Iraq and Egypt and Syria will be of particular note. And some discussion of the Obama's administration approach to what's happening in the Arab world. We'll begin the remarks with Lina Khatibm. Each speaker will have 12 minutes. We'll try to keep the time, after which we will move to questions and answers. Question cards can be found at your tables, and the staff will be walking around to collect them and handing the questions to me, and at the questions of answer period, we will discuss as many of them as possible. I will briefly introduce each speaker before they start. Detailed bios you will find in your booklet. So Lina Khatibm will begin this morning's session with a presentation titled From Opposition to Jihadism in Syria, examining the factors that have contributed to the transformation of the Syrian Uprising that called for democracy, and how that reached into the current affairs of the transformation. Lina is the head of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House and a research associate at the School of Oriental and African Studies at University of London. Formerly, she was the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut and co-founder of the Program on Arab Reform and Democracy at Stanford University's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. She has published a number of books, 7 books, including Taking to the Streets, the Transformation of Arab Activism. Lina, please, we are looking forward to your remarks, and you have 12 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today reflecting on the trajectory of the Syrian conflict. I say this a pleasure, but of course, the actual reflection is going to be far from it. Although I had said I would talk about the factors contributing to the transformation of the Syrian crisis into the conflict that it is today, I'm not actually going to focus on domestic factors, regional factors, because this conference is about the Obama legacy. I'm going to limit myself to talking about the role of the United States in getting us where we are today. That doesn't mean that the other factors aren't important. It's just that, I want to focus it on this one issue. So starting with the milestones, if we look back at this conflict, I think it's useful, now that this administration is approaching its end, to look back at what happened and how the administration has handled the different milestones and the different actors in this conflict. I think the very first milestone was obviously the uprising in Syria. In August 2011, Obama said, Assad must go. Subsequently, we had visits by the US ambassador to Syria at the time, Robert Ford, to protests in Hama, for example, talking to people, and this increased local expectations of foreign support. I know that Dr. Azmi Bshara earlier talked about the difference between supporting transition and supporting civilians in a genocide situation, but at that time, the US made parallels in its rhetoric between the Arab uprisings elsewhere and what was going on in Syria, and this led to expectations of foreign support for the transition. And at the time, we weren't talking about military support. We were only talking about political support. But this support, of course, as we know, failed to arrive. What did arrive was money and weapons from all kinds of sources, and the opposition transformed, to a degree, not all of it, but a lot of it, into armed groups as a reaction to the continued crackdown by the Assad regime. So we have seen how the US, I would say, failed the protesters in Syria in 2011 who were calling for peaceful change. If we look at another milestone, which again Dr. Bshara talked about, the red line in the air, August 2013, when President Obama said that the US would strike in Syria should evidence prove the regime has used chemical weapons. Of course, this never materialized. The result is that the US lost credibility, not just among Syrians, but also for Assad himself, who stopped taking US pressure seriously. And Russia, of course, gained confidence as a result of that, and this in turn undermined US leverage over peace talks, and this has been the case ever since, and now we're at a stage where nobody really believes Kerry's talks of a plan B when it comes to Syria. The US also, I would say, mishandled the Syrian opposition. If you remember, back in 2012, the US kept insisting that the opposition in Syria must unite before more support is given, even though in December 2012, the UK, France, and Gulf countries all recognized the Syrian National Coalition as the legitimate representative of the Syrian people. And when it came to military support, the US did send some low-level equipment to the Free Syrian Army. But of course, this military support was not enough to allow them to tip the balance on the ground. And then as more jihadist groups started forming in Syria, the discourse shifted in Washington to become one about the fear that Islamist extremists would take over Syria if Assad were to fall. And of course, December 2013, January 2014, we saw the suspension of non-lethal weapons given to Syrian rebels in northern Syria after some Islamist rebels seized Western-supplied weapons from the Free Syrian Army. And of course, what this did was weaken the Free Syrian Army even more, not just that they had attacks by groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, but also the US and its allies reduced the amount of military support it was giving them. And of course, this made the Islamist jihadist groups a lot more powerful on the ground. At the top of those groups, of course, we have ISIS, the Islamic State, IS, ISIL, whatever you want to call it. The US, I would argue, also has mishandled this particular organization. First of all, the US said it's taking an Iraq first strategy to handling ISIS. And then, when it came to looking at Syria, the United States decided to take an ISIS first approach. So the US, as we know, led the formation of a military coalition to target ISIS, and this illustrated to the Syrian opposition that the West was willing to intervene directly to counter ISIS, but not to protect civilians in opposition-held areas from barrel bombs at the hand of the regime. Of course, all this meant that ISIS benefited and it grew. And meanwhile, other jihadist groups in Syria also benefited and grew and proved themselves to be more effective at fighting the regime than the Free Syrian Army. And this, of course, led some Free Syrian Army members to change their affiliations and start cooperating more with the groups that they saw as being more effective. Now, of course, this situation that I'm describing is only part of the puzzle. It's not the full picture. However, this dynamic is important to highlight because ever since, I would say, last year, we have had an almost obsession in the US as well as in London with categorizing groups in Syria into so-called moderates and so-called extremists. And this misses the dynamic on the ground, which is a lot of people are not joining groups out of ideology, but out of a desire for military effectiveness, the need to generate funding, to feed their families, or because of local ties. And all this has sadly been missing in the US debate about different armed groups in Syria. And the obsession with weapons falling into the wrong hands has been given again and again as an excuse for not supporting the Free Syrian Army through weapons that are of higher quality than what they have been given. And as we know, more recently we have seen support to groups such as the Southern Front practically stop. And meanwhile, ISIS operations around the world began, and this illustrated that Obama's policy of containment has actually failed. And so what I would say is that US policy towards Syria has not just contributed to halting the country's prospects of a transition, but it has also increased the cost of Western intervention, limiting its already narrow set options. All of this, of course, paved the way for Russia to come into the picture and play an increasingly central role in the Syrian conflict, to the degree that now no solution to the Syrian conflict can happen without Russian blessing. And in a way, the US retreat or inaction in Syria has pushed the US into a corner, losing its credibility on the ground and allowing Russia to take advantage, as we are seeing. So if you just look at the different actors who are all playing a role in Syria today, I would say Russia now calls the shots more than anybody. And Russia, of course, is now able to do this at a very low cost, despite what many people say. The cost to Russia of its activities in Syria is actually not very high, whereas the cost to the West is actually quite high. So if we look at the Obama legacy in Syria, can I pick one thing that I would say the US did well in this particular situation? Personally, and I am someone who has been working very closely on the Syrian file for a number of years, actually since before the uprising. Personally, I don't think the US contributed anything positive to the Syrian conflict whatsoever. I would go as far as saying the US has mishandled every single milestone, has mishandled every single actor, whether that actor is a positive actor or a negative actor. The US has failed in handling the protesters in Syria. The US has failed in dealing with the Assad regime. The US has failed in dealing with the opposition, whether political or military. The US has failed in dealing with ISIS. It actually made the problem much worse. The US has also failed its Arab allies, and this is not something that I talked about in my presentation, but this is something that I think came across in Dr. Azmi Bshara's presentation this morning. The US is currently also failing in the way it is dealing with Russia when it comes to the Syrian issue. More than anything else, the US has failed the Syrian people at large. And this is where I will finish on that very optimistic note. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Lina. And as you know, all of us, I'm going to be handing notes of 5 minutes and 2 minutes just to help us all stay within the frame of time. And thank you, Lina, for keeping time so well. So Our next speaker is Emad Shahin. His presentation is titled Egypt Beyond Failed Transitions. Emad will focus on factors responsible for the failed transitions in Egypt and possible avenues the country can take for a different future. Emad Shahin is the Hasib Sabbah Distinguished Visiting Chair of Arabic and Islamic Studies and Visiting Professor of Political Science at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He is also a professor of public policy at the American University in Cairo, currently on sabbatical. Emad has published widely in scholarly journals and books, including his book, The Struggle Over Democracy in the Middle East and North Africa, which was published in 2010. Emad, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Of course, I would like to thank the Arab Center and University of Denver for the invitation. Given, of course, the 12 minutes that I have, I will focus on two main themes. One is the lessons that we can draw from the failed transition in Egypt. Of course, my focus here on Egypt, and I will draw on other experiences of transition. And in doing so, I will focus actually on the big issues, the major questions, more than just going or focusing on the fault of each actor and what happened in details. And the second theme would be how can we go beyond the failed transition and we can re-establish a democratic process that can lead to civilian control once again, if ever, of course, in Egypt. Now, the lessons, I will focus on four major lessons. One, of course, is the first thing is the nature of the state under which or within which the democratic transition in Egypt has taken place. The assumption here was that the state itself as agencies, apparatus, and different entities is a neutral agent. And once you remove the head of the state can operate daily operation, and it can function as an enabler of the revolution itself and the demands of that revolution. That, of course, was the perception of the Muslim Brotherhood by going into elections, maybe prematurely, and also many of the liberals. And the exception of this assumption, of course, were the for the revolutionaries, social revolutionaries, and the left of center, and the revolutionists themselves that wanted to dismantle this state and build a new one. Of course, the development showed that this neutral state did not exist, and actually the state, not only in Egypt, but in different countries, have not been acting or did not have the capacity to act as an inclusive agent that can integrate the different either ideological forces in society or sectarian forces in society, depending on the context, or tribal forces or regional forces in society. So it was not this kind of mechanism or machine that can bring society and can reflect society together. The second thing, of course, is the issue of the state itself and those within the state and their perception of outsiders, meaning the chances for a democratic transition to succeed, given that the main actors or the transfer of power will lead to outsiders taking over the state. Outsiders here, I mean, for example, people that are not coming from within the state institutions apparatus, not military, intelligence, even political party, dominant political party, even the bureaucracy itself. And I think this was one major obstacle in the transition in Egypt because, again, everybody within the state and even outside considered the victory of the Muslim Brotherhood as illegitimate. And that, of course, we can explain in detail how Morsi himself was described and how the Muslim Brotherhood, but this idea of that these were not really legitimate rulers in the strict sense of the practice itself of ruling the country. It stayed 1 year in power, and we all know that they had very little control. The third element that concerned the state, of course, is the nature of the institutions and structures of the state itself. And the big discovery that actually what was there was not a rational, functioning state, but actually a number or several agencies that acted as self-serving entities within that state. What General Sisi later on described as shibh dawla. It was a quasi-state. And the reason why he was saying that the state of Mubarak was a quasi-state, I think from his perspective, was his perception of the role of the military in that state, starting from Sadat and Mubarak himself. The military under these two regimes acted as actually a ruling agent or agency. It was the ruling institution, either directly or behind the scene, the most influential decision maker in the polity itself. Under Mubarak, of course, that role started to change, and the military changed from a ruling agency into an interest group, more or less. We all talk about the economic interest and so on. And that's why you see what's happening in Egypt is really dramatic and profound. It's not just coincidental that the military is reassuming its role as a ruling institution as opposed to just a functional institution. That's a major transformation. So the lesson we draw from this is that the old state cannot act as an agent of change for any democratic transition or any revolution to be, or the demands of the revolution to be enacted or enforced in the future. The second element or the second lesson is about the socioeconomic factor in the transition. Many people, of course, overlook this. I hope you realize what I'm doing now, I'm not focusing on the traditional explanations, the actors who did what and so on. I'm just going beyond this. So the socioeconomic, and that was very crucial because most of the Arab uprisings and the Arab revolutions that took place were not in the form or the modality of grand revolutions, meaning that they are not like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution, i.e. that they were not based on class conflict, major socioeconomic conflicts in society. However, these revolutions raised some kind of socioeconomic slogans and demands. Bread, al-aish, that was one element. Or social justice, that was another element. When we see throughout the transition in practice, this narrative was very weak and did not actually meet the expectations of the people. And the manifestation for this is the economic model that everybody actually, no vision, of course, economic vision, revolutionary economic vision, and the economic vision that was implemented later on actually was inspired by the Turkish model, which is the neoliberal economic vision that did not meet and could not meet the demands of the majority of the people that did not participate in that revolution. So that actually, again, in the transition, the ability of this revolution to make quick gains, to appeal to a large segment of the population was very limited. Yes, so I'll just say the headlines and then you fill in the space. But anyway, so it was very limited. The other issue, of course, is even by the revolutionaries themselves, when people started in Egypt to rise up and ask for socioeconomic demands, they called them what? Sectoral demands, matalib fi'awiyya, which is very demeaning and not legitimate, genuine socioeconomic demands of large segments of the population, civil service, and bureaucracy, and so on. I have to move very quickly, so excuse me in this. The third lesson or the third issue about the transition is the mechanical linkage and very deterministic linkage that took place between democratic transition and the enhancements of democracy in established systems, democratic systems. There was this mistake on everybody's part. Very quickly, the example, the majoritarian tendencies when it comes to I win 51%, then I do whatever I like. I have the majority and so on. And on the other side, also the opposition, liberal opposition or secular opposition felt that they can boycott, they can act as spoilers, they can withdraw their support, they can even call for early election for the first transitional democratic elections or transitional period, which some liberals now realize that that was a mistake because this was a very precarious transition that should have been consolidated and not disintegrated. The fourth one, of course, is the external one element about also the mechanical is the respect of rule of law. At that time, like resorting to the Constitutional Court of Mubarak to decide on issues that actually will have a very detrimental impact on the transition itself. And that we have seen it. The Constitutional Court many times canceled, dismissed the parliament, postponed the elections, and really impeded the process itself. The external actor actors also can, this is another lesson, can fail the transition. The destabilization that has taken place, the militarization of the uprisings, and finally, of course, the change of narrative of the whole process and the Arab Spring, from aspirations and expectations for freedom. This is the narrative. It was a very beautiful narrative. Freedom, youth, future, and so on, into what kind of narrative now? Terrorism, ISIS, security, fighting terrorism, and so on. So that's a major shift even in the narrative and in the support. Now, beyond the transition, the essence of the transition actually is to transform, to change, to move from repressive police state and military hegemony into civilian rule, democratic state, and rule of law. That's the essence of the transition. For Egypt, just to be realistic, this is a very long process, given, of course, what Egypt is going through now. Very repressive regime, not giving any kind of a chance for or opportunity for political opening, and at the same time, very weak and fragmented opposition, and finally, complacent regional and international actors that are supporting and enabling that regime to continue with its repression. So where is the key in this? If we would like to go, excellent. If we would like to go beyond the transition, the key actually is in a broad civilian coalition that can provide a viable alternative to the existing regime. I wish I had time to explain this, because this is a major fallacy that exists in most think tanks here, that Sisi does not have, there is no alternative to Sisi. My argument is there are plenty of alternatives to Sisi. Plenty of alternatives to Sisi. Search in the jails, Egypt jails. Search in Egypt, among Egyptians in exile. There are many that can really act as an alternative to Sisi, and it's not true that there is no alternative to Saddam Hussein, there is no alternative to Gamal Mubarak. That was exactly the same argument. But anyway, that's a long thing. In order to move, we need at least 3 issues that have to be taken into consideration. One is the agreement on a vision, a common objective, and a written document, a charter that we can all, as civilian opposition or civilian actors, can get together to discuss at least, but we have to have something. And here Tunisia is very important, because this is exactly what happened to Tunisia. Before 2011, they already had the meetings and the dialogue in 2005, 2008, 2010 that culminated in what's called the October 18, 2010 document, Our Road to Democracy, طريقنا إلى الديمقراطية. That was a process that built trust, that allowed the different political actors to know each other's fears, concerns, and appreciate that. That's something that has to be done. The second issue is, of course, or factor beyond this failed transition, is institutional frameworks for the road or the path to getting rid of this military regime, and also for the day after that military regime. I just mentioned the headlines because I'm sure I'll be stopped in a minute. The third is keep mounting pressure on the regime itself on several fronts. It's human rights violations, and here, of course, the West should play a role, and international NGOs should play a role when it comes to the human rights violation in Egypt. It's economic failure, and where it's taking the country economically and socially, failing to protect even Egypt's strategic interests, the water, the gas, the territories, Egypt territories. We have never seen before, at least in my lifetime, a country that was defending its relinquishing of its territorial land to another country, giving away, selling away to islands like this and defending that. And of course, finally, pressuring the regime from within. Some people are considering the issue of running or fielding a candidate against Sisi. That's fine as long as it doesn't give any kind of legitimacy to the regime. Finally, of course, outside pressure to allow for some political openings. Most transitions, if you look at Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, there must be some kind of an opening that can lead to a tipping point. That has to be done by some kind of pressure. Egypt cannot, or Egyptian inside even, cannot do it alone, giving the extent of the pressure that the regime is mounting. Is this too optimistic? Definitely it is very optimistic. Because someone tell you, look at the Egyptian opposition and so on. But that's our job as at least, our task as intellectuals, to manufacture hope. We have to manufacture this hope. Now, while realizing also the enormity of this task, as really one of our mentors says, Tariq al-Bishri, he always says that, our task is to fix the train while it's running. It doesn't stop, and it's not going to stop. It's an ongoing process, and this is exactly our task. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This is wonderful. I'm going to be using this 12 minutes. You know, you noticed it's not 10, it's not 15. It gives the message that it's going to be sharp. I'm going to be using this in future conferences and meetings. So our next speaker is Michelle Dunne, who will discuss the internal and external factors impacting the failed, troubled transitions of the Arab Spring, as well as prospects for political reform. Michelle Dunne is the director and senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace's Middle East program. She was the founding director of the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East at the Atlantic Council, and the senior associate and editor of the Arab Reform Bulletin at Carnegie. She worked for the U.S. Department of State as a Middle East specialist, including assignments with the National Security Council and with the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. Michelle, the floor is yours, and you have 12 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks very much to the Arab Center and the University of Denver for inviting me. And if you'll forgive me, I'm going to do something that is more typical of an academic than a think tanker and argue with the question or the premise of the discussion here, which is, why did the Arab Spring democratic transitions fail? Look, from my point of view, what has happened in the last few years was most likely one of several major waves of political change that will sweep over this region, the Middle East and North Africa, over a period probably of several decades, similar to other periods that we can look at: Latin America, East Asia, Europe. These things, an entire region did not change in a very short period. They change played out in different countries at different paces, and even when change did leave behind some democratic transitions, it didn't leave behind a uniform map of either democracy or autocracy, but rather a patchwork of different systems, and those systems themselves were dynamic over time. I'm sure you'll hear later, for example, from Frank Fukuyama and others about democratic backsliding and so forth. So the premise that an entire region or a set of countries or even a single country makes a simple transition from category A, autocracy, to category B, democracy, and that I think is not correct, and that if it doesn't make that transition in a single move in a few years, that it has quote unquote failed. I think this is a misleading way to view the situation, and I would guess that very few of my fellow panelists here predicted at the time that the Arab countries experienced uprisings in 2011 that many of them, or even any of them, would make smooth transitions to democracy within only a few years. I don't think that was the expectation. So we keep I feel, setting up this straw man and constantly having to whack at this straw man of what has happened in the region. At the same time, though, let me say this. My guess is that if you ask my fellow panelists here, back in, say, mid-2011, if you looked at the countries that were undergoing uprisings there, Lina's already spoken about Syria, Emad has already spoken about Egypt, and all the others. If you had asked the people on this panel, which one of the countries that is undergoing an uprising right now in mid-2011 has the best chance at making a transition to democracy, my guess is that every single person on this panel would have guessed correctly Tunisia. I'm thinking back to a conversation that I had, and I wish I could remember with whom I had this conversation. It was at a conference on a day just like this, and it was well before 2011. It was well before 2010. And I was having a discussion with someone about prospects for democracy in the Arab world, and this person asked me, well, if you just had to pick one Arab country that maybe has the best chance of making a transition to democracy within the next decade, which one would you pick? And I thought, and I said, Tunisia. And why did I say that? It's not that I foresaw the uprising that happened in Tunisia, right? I didn't do that any more than anyone else. But I think we all knew that Tunisia was a bit different from other Arab countries. That the population was, in general, more educated, that women were more liberated and empowered, that the middle class was a bit larger in Tunisia, that the military was less involved in politics, that it was more connected to Europe and so forth than the other countries. And all of these things turned out to be very, very important. A factor that I think turned out to be very important in Tunisia was that previous Tunisian regimes, in particular under Bourguiba, made an investment in human development, and particularly in education and in women's empowerment. They were not democrats, they were repressive and so forth, but they did make an investment in human development. And that turned out to be really important. The other things I think that were not at all obvious to me before 2011, but I've thought about a lot since, is that Tunisia had other assets that stood it in good stead after 2011, which were the country's size and its location. Not its enormous size and its important location. On the contrary, its small size and its less important location. Simply put, Tunisia, I think, was just small enough, just remote enough, just humble enough to seem not that much of a threat or a prize to the regional powers that intervened very much in the other transitions, right? We're talking about Turkey, we're talking about Iran, we're talking about Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, that each played their roles for good or for ill inside these countries. And they vied very hotly for influence in 2011 in a climate in which the United States, as Lina's already indicated, basically abdicated a leadership role in the region, and Europe terribly, terribly preoccupied with its own internal financial and other crises, okay? So, yes, even in Tunisia, there was some limited political interference from outside and so forth, but Tunisians were largely left to figure things out for themselves. And that they have done. I mean, there was, Emad just described briefly the process that took place among Tunisian leaders in exile, a process of dialogue and I think maturation in terms of their ideas, their political philosophies, and so forth. And then, you know, we can see with the civil society institutions and so forth in Tunisia that they've played an important role in political, coming to political consensus, having this sort of very interesting combination, I think, in Tunisia between political competition and consensus building. Now, and that doesn't mean that everything is all over in Tunisia. I was listening very carefully to some of the things that Emad was saying about Egypt. This idea that perhaps the state could not be a neutral agent, that it could undermine the bureaucracy itself, could resist and undermine a transition. That's a very live issue in Tunisia right now. It's about the security sector, but not only the security sector, other parts of the bureaucracy as well. And the idea that socioeconomically the revolution did not meet the demands of people. Very live issue in Tunisia right now, and particularly the issue of fostering development in the peripheral regions of Tunisia, the regions that have been treated as peripheral for a long time. So it's by no means a done deal in Tunisia, but clearly, they have. What I would say about Tunisia is Tunisia now, because of its nascent democratic transition, has different ways to solve its problems than other Arab countries have in general. So to me, look, the major challenge facing the Arab countries is this. Because of global economic realities, they need to move beyond their rent-based economies toward productive economies that can employ their young and, in many cases, rapidly growing populations. And that inevitably leads to a shift in the social contract between governments and citizens. But as I said, this is a much more complicated process, and the outcomes of it will probably be much more diverse than a shift from the category of autocracy to the category of democracy. And so I suggest we need to look at this in a different way. Just a word on U.S. policy. I think the major challenge for actors outside the Arab region, including the United States, is to develop ways of interacting with this region that go beyond security assistance and arms sales, which frankly, those are the major modes of the United States interacting with this region at this point. There's some limited diplomacy, there's some limited economic assistance, but US policy has become highly securitized. And indeed, the security situation in the Arab world is very troubled, and the Arab world is now the region, the Middle East, North Africa region, is viewed primarily as a threat, as a security threat to the United States and to its allies in Europe. So there's a lot of preoccupation here with the weakness of the Arab states, their inability to resist, for example, the spread of ISIS and so forth. Now, it's well known that the Arab states have been weakened by the way of change, but I think that this weakness cannot be addressed only by adding coercive force to the Arab states without improvements in economic development, social justice, rule of law, pluralism, etc. So while the United States can't make those things happen in Arab countries, it makes no sense for the United States to simply ignore those issues and keep adding coercive force to governments, to partner governments that are in many cases exacerbating rather than addressing these problems. We're living in an era in which individual citizens and non-state actors worldwide are becoming more powerful and governments are becoming less powerful. I think that it poses a dilemma. It's something for the next U.S. administration to think about very seriously. How does the United States engage with the Middle East region going through this painful and I think long period of change? Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Please keep sending your questions, and thank you for the great handwriting. So far, I have read all of them. Our next speaker is Abdulwahab Al-Qassab, his presentation will examine why prospects for democracy in Iraq have been unfulfilled. Abdulwahab Al-Qassab is an associate researcher at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Doha, the big sister organization of this center, and is currently a visiting scholar at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. He founded Al-Zaman Center for Strategic Studies in Iraq and was a consultant to the Iraqi Center for Strategic Studies in Amman and the Center for Strategic Studies of the Qatar Armed Forces. Abdulwahab, اتفضل.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. The problem which I'll try to tackle in this 12 minutes time allotted to me is, was there a real democracy in Iraq? One. If there was, why it failed? This is the second. To understand this, we have to understand the Iraqi society as such. And the Iraqi society now is described as a diverse society. And yes, it is partially diverse because there are a lot of values shared by all the components of the Iraqi society. We have two major components, the Arabs and Kurds. But the Arabs and Kurds share their religion, Islam, which brings those two components together. What had been introduced into the country after the invasion was the fragmentation of the country on the basis of sectarian, ethnic, and so on and so forth basis. And actually, this was the major reason why things in Iraq started to be in such a very deteriorative manner. We can shed light upon the major actors within the Iraqi society before the invasion and after the invasion. And by matching these actors together, we can deduce that the difference is the thing which led to the present situation in Iraq. Iraq actually before the invasion was a secular state. It was the first secular state in the Arab East. It was the first country which attained independence and entered the League of Nations back October 1932. It was the first, actually. And it was a constitutional monarchy. And there was a sort of transition of power in a peaceful way. There were parties. But was that a real democracy? The answer is no. It was shadows of democracy only. But even these shadows had been disappeared when the 1958 toppling of the royal regime took place under the coup d'etat, which had been led by the army. This will lead us to try to see who are the actors at that period. We can bring the actors up under the following headings. The first actor was the elite, being intelligentsia or the elite which was the governmental leadership. And those were originally Arab Ottoman officers who helped too much to build the modern Iraqi state. After the elite came the army. The military also was an actor. And the tribes also were main factor of the actors within the Iraqi society. And we have the insurgency in certain regions, and especially in Kurdistan in the north. This is the shape by which the Iraqi society acted before 2003. Before 2003, these actors were, matching it and quarreling with each other, trying to grab the power, trying to topple the power, bringing about up to 1958, as I told you, a sort of democracy. And on the same time, there was a good deal of trying to modernize, and this has been to be underlined, modernize the society. This was quite seen of the very wide range of, academics, intelligentsia, illiteracy within the country. Now, coming to the 2003, after the invasion, what had happened? The main thing is that vacuum which had been the main symptom of war in the country. And this vacuum was filled by two types of actors who were not known before in the Iraqi society. And by this I mean this sectarianism versus Al-Qaeda, or fanaticism, Islamic fanaticism. And both of them are Islamic political movements. For this, the clergy of both sides tried to have a role. And it exercised a very negative role in leading and directing the general opinion, the public opinion of the Iraqi society, which is now started to be factionalized. And it was divided upon itself into Sunnis and Shias, that the Arab majority, and Arabs and Kurds, Turkmens, Mandais, Yazidis, and so on and so forth. So trying to fragment, the fragmentation process took place in the Iraqi society, and after that, those unifying factors which were bringing the Iraqi society before together, and if I am talking about the Arab society in Iraq, we had many strong unifying factors, because Arabs in Iraq started on the northernmost point in Mosul, in Nainawa, and the tribe started to be Sunni, and you are coming down up to 70 kilometers south of Baghdad. The same tribe will be transformed into a Shia zone. So this unifying factor had been shattered, and the people were aligned along the sectarian affinity because of the negative role, as I told you, of the clergy in Iraq. And the clergy in Iraq, being Sunni or Shia, were fighting each other. One say, go for election, the second say, don't go for election. Both of them employing the name of the God, that the blessing of the God will be devoid of you if you go, or the blessing of God will be devoid of you if you don't go. So the Iraqi citizen, the Iraqi Arab citizen was, crushed in the middle of these things. Now, there was a democratic regime introduced after the invasion. The first constitution, which had been, hardly accepted by all the people, guarantees the elections, the 4 years transition of power, political power, and the right of the Iraqi citizen to go for elections. And these elections had been, unfortunately, misused by the clergy to direct the people either to boycott on one hand, or to go and vote for on the other hand. This also added one very negative point to the scene, to the political scene in Iraq. Adding to that, the non-state actors who manifested the country, and there are again two types. You have ISIS or Al-Qaeda before, ISIS on one hand, and you go the Iranian-backed militias on the second hand. So these took the power on their own, and prevented the government and its establishment to exercise the lawful way of administrating the countries, and started to dictate, and started to, exercise, for example, cleansing, sectarian cleansing. We've seen that in Diyala, for example, in Muqdadiya, for example, in Tikrit, even in Fallujah up to now. And there is a scene, what will be happened if those militias had been given a chance to fight to liberate Mosul from ISIS. So these actors also, the non-governmental actors, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the militias also very negatively acted on the Iraqi society. Adding to that, again, one very important reason, and that is precisely the malfunction of the government, inactivity of the government, and the affiliation of the ministers of the government to their sects and parties, political parties, rather than to the Iraqi nationalism as such. And this led to what Iraq is living now under the state of corruption, which devoid the country of about $800 billion during those past years, which could bring out the country as one of the most modern countries in the region. Now, what is expected to be, or how to remedy this very negative scene? The thing is quite important to understand that majority of this was because of the Iranian intervention within the internal affairs of Iraq. So to cut this intervention will add value, very positive value, to the way the Iraqis to look upon themselves, asking themselves, how can we come together once again? And we have a lot of shared values, as I said. We have a lot of very constructive aspect. I say the fail of democracy in Iraq is only pertained to the negative aspects in the constitution itself. So try to address the constitution and bring out a new constitution based on one man, one voice for every one citizen. Iraqis are equal. This is the remedy. The time is short, so I cannot express whatever I want, but I'm quite ready to answer any question. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Abdulwahab. Our last speaker is Peter Beinart. I have been getting questions to Peter even before he spoke. Peter will discuss Obama's unfulfilled legacy in the Arab Spring and the impact of the administration's policies on the troubled transformation and what could be done in that regard. Peter Beinart is an associate professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York. He is a contributing editor to The Atlantic, a senior columnist for Haaretz, and a CNN political commentator. Beinart has written for numerous other publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Financial Times. So, Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief since I'm last, and I'm very afraid of those cards. I know by far of the people on this panel the least about the events on the ground, so I will try instead to talk about what maybe I know at least maybe a little bit about, which is I think about the Obama administration's perception of the Middle East and how it fit into its more general foreign policy challenges. So in shorthand, I guess my view of the Obama administration's policy in the Middle East is that I think that Obama set out wanting to be Jimmy Carter and ended up being Richard Nixon. Now, you can say, how could anyone set out wanting to be Jimmy Carter, right? I think in a way Jimmy Carter even didn't ultimately become Jimmy Carter. I'll try to explain what I mean by that a little bit. I think Obama came in facing a situation which was in some ways analogous to the situation the presidents of the 1970s, Nixon and Carter faced, which is that he came in following a period of overstretch, following a period of hubris, the hubris of the 1960s that got America into Vietnam, the hubris of the post-9/11 era that got America into Iraq and Afghanistan, in which previous leaders had essentially acted as if America's military, economic, and ideological power were unlimited. Right? He was dealing with the very bitter hangover of that, just as Carter and Nixon were. Now, the problem that Carter and Nixon both had to deal with was that an ideological construct had built up through the 1960s called global containment, which basically said that the U.S. had to stop any so-called communist movement, whether we knew anything about it or not, really, from basically taking any new territory anywhere around the world. This was far too ambitious a mandate for American foreign policy to be able to fulfill. So Nixon, that was the problem that Nixon and Carter both faced, but they addressed it in different ways. Carter was the only president of the Cold War who actually tried to frontally challenge the idea of global containment. He only did it briefly, only really in 1977 and 1978. But in his speech at Notre Dame and in other places, he basically said, look, we don't have to worry so much about whether some communist movement takes power in some third world country that's not really powerful and doesn't really represent a threat to us. We don't need to worry about it so much. We don't have to man all those ramparts. And in fact, we'll be better off if we don't do that. Nixon, Carter challenged this, what he called the inordinate fear of communism. And he thought that if the U.S. Stopped being so afraid of communism, we could be more concerned about human rights, because we would not be sucked into supporting all of these third world dictators that had us on a string because they were supposedly standing up against the communist threat. Carter was, I think, in a way, more than is recognized, actually, like Obama, I think a bit of a Fukuyamian. And this is, although Carter's associated in the American memory with malaise, I think Carter was actually very optimistic about the natural competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and thought that basically our political and economic system was stronger and would prevail whether or not a few skirmishes in the Third World went the Soviet Union's way. He was the only president of the Cold War to try to kind of liberate American foreign policy from the Munich analogy, from the idea essentially, or the domino theory, that essentially the world was so threatening that if the Soviets won anywhere, basically the whole house of cards might come falling down. Nixon's approach was totally different. Nixon never challenged really the idea of global containment ideologically. He tried to prosecute global containment more cheaply. He withdrew the ground troops from Vietnam. He relied on air power instead. You did a lot more with covert missions because they're cheaper, same reason that Eisenhower liked them. And he relied on what's called the Nixon Doctrine, which is basically say we can't contain the communists around the world, but we'll send a lot of arms to countries like people like the Shah of Iran to contain them for us. Carter's effort politically was a failure. It was a failure because once things happened that made America become more afraid, whatever political support he had for this challenge kind of collapsed. But I think that Obama, in many ways, took power with some of the same instincts as Carter. He thought that the threat of terrorism had been exaggerated. He was much less concerned than the people around George W. Bush with the idea that jihadism represented an ideological threat. Right? Bush was constantly talking about this as the new Cold War, the new World War II. There was fascism and communism, and now there was, jihadism or Islamism. I think Obama never bought into that idea. He never thought that this was really a powerful ideological force that we were facing, because he didn't believe that it represented prosperity for anybody. There weren't people who really believed that you could build a new prosperous world based on the ideas of Osama bin Laden in the way that some people had believed in the 1930s and 40s you could do based on communism and fascism. I think Obama also thought, like Carter, that this global construct that he had inherited, the war on terror, right? Bush had created this construct called the war on terror, in which basically America was not only fighting against al-Qaeda, but also fighting against Iran, basically fighting against anyone who we classified as terrorist or jihadist, even though it was a very, very broad brush. Again, just in the way that the war against the effort to contain communism had become so broad by the 1960s that it included both China and Russia, even though they were at odds with one another. We were now involved in this global construct where we were fighting basically both Sunni jihadists and Iran at the same time, and basically acting as if they were the same. I think Obama inherited this, and like Carter, wanted initially to challenge it. He thought that people had exaggerated the threat. He thought that in the name of this, we were complicit in a lot of human rights violations that he wanted to try to do something about, both directly and indirectly vis-a-vis our allies. And again, I think Obama was, a little bit like Carter, kind of a Fukuyamian, which is essentially Obama believed that basically America was was ideologically on the side of history, that basically our liberal democratic idea, our capitalist system, if we could kind of, patch up some of the holes that had emerged under the Bush era, was basically going to be very strong, and rejected the kind of more apocalyptic view that you tended to see from people in the Bush administration, that these people were potentially as powerful as the Nazis and the communists. And I think, interestingly, Obama just personally, and I was told this a number of times, I'm sure Michelle and others heard this, had a tremendous amount of personal sympathy for the protesters in the Arab Spring. That although Obama gets painted as a realist sometimes, I think that one close Obama aide told me that Obama felt a tremendous identification with the protesters in Tahrir Square, and a tremendous personal animus towards people like Mubarak, partly because Obama felt that the third world dictatorship and the way it closed off possibilities for people to reach their potential had been part of what killed his father in Kenya. Obama's father was a very talented young man, remember, returned to Kenya and basically had no opportunities despite his talent, partly because he was the wrong ethnic group, but partly just because it was a dictatorship that didn't allow people to fulfill their potential. So this person argued to me that although Obama is sometimes caricatured as maybe having a sympathy for third world dictatorships, that actually Obama had, from his own experience, a particularly deep hostility because of the way he interpreted his own father's story. I think the problem was that Obama, like Carter, was unable to really, politically, in the domestic politics front, unable to frontally challenge this idea of this kind of fairly monolithic, very threatening terrorist menace. Part of the reason is he never, like Carter, he didn't create essentially a kind of foreign policy counter-establishment in his own party. I mean, Carter was there with Zbigniew Brzezinski, with a national security advisor who was far more hawkish than him, who never really bought into his desire to challenge the idea of global containment. And similarly, although there were some suggestion during the campaign that Obama was trying to create a group of foreign policy people who were going to kind of challenge some of the assumptions of the Clinton administration, especially once he chose Hillary Clinton as his Secretary of State. You often found that Obama was essentially more dovish than most of the other important people in the room around him, who were a little more hawkish and also a little more realist in their desire to kind of stick with U.S. allies. I think you can see the two kind of key moments where in Obama's efforts to challenge this idea of the kind of global war on terror, as first the Iran deal. And I think the Iran deal was in a way a great success for Obama, in a way a failure, because I think the bargain that Obama had to make in order to get that passed, especially with the Democrats, was to say, we can get support for, we can push through the nuclear deal, but the Cold War with Iran will remain. I think that's essentially the bargain that Obama had to strike with the Democrats, that maybe even the Cold War with Iran will be intensified. So the idea that you could ratchet down this notion of a kind of monolithic global terrorist threat really failed in the Iran deal. We was able to get the nuclear program through, but in some ways had to retreat from the idea that there would be a wholly new kind of relationship with Iran. The second was the rise of ISIS and the massive increase, fueled by cable news, of the threat of terror that emerged in 2014. Just as happened with Carter when you saw the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, once fear rose in the American people, it became impossible for Obama politically to try to say what I think he really believed, which was that the threat of terrorism was being massively exaggerated by a lot of people in the United States, because in the face of the terror of ISIS, that became politically very, very difficult. And so I think what Obama has ended up doing, and this is not entirely chronological, some of it, of course, he was doing from the beginning, looks a lot more like Nixon, which is essentially trying to achieve the same goals, but with at cheaper cost, right? So with air power rather than ground power, right? So by bombing and by using drones, which is a kind of version of what Nixon did when he realized he had to pull ground troops out of Vietnam, and also by relying more on America's allies. You see this in Syria, basically trying to get them to carry more of the load in terms of achieving America's foreign policy objectives, because America is not willing to pay the price militarily or economically to do it ourselves. Let me just say something about Hillary Clinton. And again, this is obviously overly stylized and a little bit cute. But I would suggest that if I think Obama in some ways wanted to be Carter and ended up being more like Nixon, I think that Hillary Clinton may end up being a little bit more like Reagan. And when I say Reagan in a particular sense, not the kind of myth of Reagan and not the idea that Reagan won the Cold War, but just to think about what Reagan's foreign policy was like in his first term. I think it's important Reagan was not someone who sent U.S. ground troops into harm's way. Reagan was actually very cautious about the deploying of U.S. ground troops because he was very constrained by the legacy of Vietnam. And I think Hillary Clinton will be similarly constrained by the legacy of Iraq in her deployment of U.S. ground troops. But what Reagan did have was he was much, much more willing to throw money around than his predecessors in order to try to take the fight to America's enemies without putting U.S. ground troops at risk. And I think this is what I think you're likely to see with Hillary Clinton, especially if the American budgetary situation improves. I think American foreign policy is often very determined by how much money there is in the bank. And I think it's probably, absent another financial crisis, there's going to be more money in the bank. America's going to be able to start spending more on the military, whereas Obama was in a period of relative retrenchment because of the financial crisis. I also think that Hillary Clinton's instincts are just different. I think that she's more hawkish than Obama, and she's more likely to believe that traditional allies need reassuring, and less willing to think unconventionally in terms of challenging foreign policy doctrines. I think it's really interesting that when she was asked by Jeff Goldberg a couple of years ago what she thought was the big problem in American foreign policy, she said, well, the big problem is that we don't believe in ourselves enough, and so we don't really therefore project that belief. I think it's really impossible to imagine Obama saying that. I think Hillary Clinton has a much more conventional belief of America's virtue in the world and will have more resources and will probably, in the way Reagan did in his first term, without using ground troops, will try to take the fight to America's enemies, be that Russia, be that Iran in this kind of in the Cold War we still find ourselves with. And I think that she will be more inclined to reassure America's traditional allies, again, in the way that Reagan did after Carter's brief and kind of failed experiment in trying to put human rights ahead of America's traditional client relationships. So I'll stop there.
Thank you all. There are many questions directed to all the panelists. This is how I would like to run this. I tried to group the questions, and then I'll give a number of questions to each panelist, and you will have, we'll start with Lina, 3 minutes or so. But other panelists are welcome to comment, but briefly, like in 1 minute on the questions. There were many questions to Lina. Basically, I think the questions were around the failure of American intervention and international intervention. And the questions are around the issue of, first, what should have been done, when, and what can be done now? What would you criticized the American policy altogether and called it a failure. So what could be done now? And there was one question that asks the following. If there is an American intervention, what are the interests of the United States in Syria to be defended in the first place? So I suggest that you start with this, Lina, and there are other questions that would be related to your presentation, but for 3 minutes, and others who would like to comment on this, please give me a sign.
Okay, thank you. I keep getting these questions. I've been getting these questions for the last 5 years or so. And at every stage, the answers, of course, change. The key question is, why should the US care? Well, look at the world today, and you tell me. The US has basically, for example, paved the way for Russia to try to become a superpower once more. Is this really in the US interest? I don't think so. So in a way, US policy in Syria, because perhaps Syria was not deemed to be an immediate concern for the national interest, ended up causing the US a much bigger problem that has to do with the standing of the United States in the world. And so we shouldn't dismiss Syria as this isolated matter somewhere far away from kind of US borders, so the US shouldn't care about it. The repercussions are huge. The tension between Russia and Europe is growing as a result of what's happening. We are at a very big global risk of Europe falling as a result of what happened in Syria. Let's just think about what is going on in Europe at the moment. Europe has largely also retreated, waiting for the US to take the lead on Syria. But Russia has sought to weaken Europe, and Brexit is one manifestation of this. The refugee crisis in Europe is a manifestation of this. The whole world order is at risk of being changed, and not for the better, and the roots of this do, to a degree, go back to the Syrian conflict. So I'm giving a big picture answer, because we have to think in a big picture way about US interests. What should have been done when? I mean, very early on, the US could have taken a leading diplomatic role to put pressure on the Assad regime. It didn't do that. The red line should not have been drawn in the air. All kinds of things could have been done, but weren't. And I think, to be honest, it's a bit too late now I don't prefer to reflect back. I think what matters more is to think about what can be done now in light of all the lessons. I am hoping that we do see President Clinton and not President Trump. I would be at a loss when it comes to what President Trump might decide to do or not do. But when it comes to President Clinton, we have heard that she is indeed more hawkish, yes. My concern is that by the time she comes to power, she may well also argue that it's actually too late to be hawkish in practice. And this is where I will go back to what I was saying at the beginning, which is think of the big picture. I think hope is not completely lost in Syria. Every time I think it is, I talk to Syrian activists and just people on the ground, and they remind me that they're just going to keep going until the very end because they have no other choice. There are Syrian Democrats out there. They deserve support. There are many individuals who the US should engage with to build a transitional government in Syria. This is not an issue that should be put to one side. I think any plan to have a national unity government with Assad staying in place and having representation from the opposition is just not going to work. So I would say work on a transitional government, but also change the balance of power on the ground. Give weapons that would allow the Free Syrian Army to resurrect itself, and you will see a lot of people will flock back if they see that it is delivering. I believe that the situation on the ground needs to change militarily as well as politically, and the US is the only actor who's actually able to do this. So far the US is not doing it, but maybe President Clinton can.
Shukran, Lina. I have a short follow-up. Actually, there was a question about arming the rebel groups, but do you make a distinction in your recommendation between the point that was made early on by Dr. Bishara between intervention for regime change and intervention for for the protection of civilians? I didn't see that you, is it right to say that you don't make that distinction?
Let's put it this way. How are you going to intervene in practice in order to protect civilians? Just think about it. Establishing a safe zone, a no-fly zone, is one of the proposals, but that involves being on the ground and giving weapons to people on the ground to be able to defend themselves against airstrikes. So however you spin it, I think the two are connected. And I think the distinction is mostly political and for understandable reasons. But I think in practice, even the no-fly zone involves kind of very hands-on presence.
Fair enough. Any comments from the panelists on this issue? Okay. The next set of questions, we'll come back to Syria perhaps. The next set of questions is about Egypt. And to Ahmed Shaheen, there's a number of questions. One is, Ahmed, some people are telling us here that voters decide. And when voters decide, we have to take that decision very seriously. And the other question is Sisi so bright to fool the whole world and to fool the West, or is he really fighting terrorists? And there are, of course, indications that there are some terrorist organizations, particularly in the Sinai. The other question is about the role of Egyptian capitalists in supporting the neoliberalism that Sisi represents in Egypt, and what's the role of these capitalists, and where did the deep state that everybody was talking about, where did it go? Why is it not mentioned? I think that's basically it. In terms of policy recommendations, the question is what could be done to prepare a generation of leaders to lead the anti-coup forces?
All right. These questions appear to me that they are coming from the same person, but
no, actually, they are not. Actually, they are not.
Okay, the voters, of course, if we're referring
unless the person changed her or his name when they saw.
Because they are all, like the first three. Right. Anyway, they are interconnected. If you're talking, of course, about voters decide, referring to Sisi's election or Morsi's election, so it goes both ways. If voters decide, then we take this argument and apply it to the first transition under Morsi, and we say that in this case, that transition should have been ended through the ballot box, through the voters, and not through a coup. Now, if that question referring to Sisi has acquired legitimacy as a result of a popular vote, I think, the reports about the conditions under which the presidential elections took place raised a lot of questions about the transparency, about whether they were free or not, about extending it for a fourth day, things like that, even for people that, tried to... The whole thing, there are so many irregularities that have taken place. Now, is Sisi fooling the entire world? Of course not. Sisi is very smart. He's not fooling anyone. And he is presenting himself as performing a very crucial and important functional role. His role is to fight against terrorism. That's, I think, the questioner referred to that. Also, the role of preventing illegal immigrations from Europe. The role of, and that's the most important role, normalizing relationships with major regional countries with Israel, bringing Saudi Arabia to the fold of the Arab Treaty, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty through Tehran and Sanafir, and that has to be, of course, arranged through legal frameworks. If Saudi Arabia have or put claims on Tehran and Sanafir, that's something that relates to Israel immediately. That's the Strait of Tehran. And of course, the fight against terrorism. So he is presenting himself not just, as someone who's going to, no, he's someone who's going to provide stability and also has certain tasks to perform that will fall into the larger interests of Europe and the United States. And I think that's why, of course, they are giving a blind eye to many of the violations that have been taking place, on the top of which, for example, that might bring it home meaning to Europe is the Regini case, for example, and how this Regini case is being mishandled, not handled, is being mishandled. The capitalists and neoliberalism, I don't think Sisi is following, or Egypt is following now a neoliberal policy, economic policy. What we're seeing is actually a transformation from the old neoliberal policy into assigning the military as the biggest contractor in the country. Everything is almost going through the military. And the Egyptian regime has indeed frightened most of the big capitalists in the country, whether because there is a latent, implicit feud and struggle and threat from the elements of Mubarak's regime. whether the political wing or the economic wing. So we cannot really say that he is really encouraging the capitals and so on. Where is the deep state in the media, in the judiciary that has sentenced? They're still thriving. The deep state is thriving and well and alive. And you see it in the judiciary that is considered as the legal repressive arm of the regime itself, almost over 1,800 death sentences. What Sisi or the regime does not kill by the bullets, the judiciary killed by the sentencing to death. It is in the media, of course. If you look at the systematic, massive brainwashing that most Egyptians are exposed to inside, and I'm not going to give examples about the different examples that are really hilarious, but Egyptians started to believe. That's another issue. So you have the judiciary, you have the media, and you have the military and the security agencies actually running the country. We have seen how the parliamentary elections were performed and managed through the Mukhabarat itself, and including Sisi's son. I mean, these are many of the reports that alluded to this fact. So the deep state is there, and I think it's still running the show in Egypt.
Thank you. Any comments from the panelists on this? All right. The next set of yes, Michelle.
Yeah, on the question of terrorism, look, I do think Egypt has a serious terrorist problem, right? There have always been jihadi terrorists in Egypt in smaller numbers or larger numbers at different times. And there is, of course, a group based in the Sinai that has affiliated itself to the Islamic State. That's, I think, a very scary group. But one of the things that really needs to be understood about this is they're very much an indigenous group. Not only are they an indigenous group, but they're, from what I understand, highly local. That so-called Wilayat Sinai, the Sinai province of the Islamic State, which was once Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis, is made up of a few hundred fighters, almost entirely Sinai Bedouin. Why has this happened? Right, because the Sinai region has been so marginalized, repressed, and the tactics of the Egyptian state against what is terrorism, what is a scary form of terrorism there, have involved collective punishment of the local population and so forth. So, whereas I would never say there's no terrorism in Egypt, and I'm sure Emad wouldn't either. It is a serious problem. My concern, and frankly, I hear this concern a lot from people in the U.S. government when I speak to them, is that the methods of Sisi against terrorism are fueling the problem. I mean, there was a significant attack in the Sinai today. Which is the largest one in some months. But they're fueling the problem both in terms of specifically how they handle the Sinai and other regions, as well as the massive prison population of almost all young, tens of thousands of political prisoners of different political persuasions, some of them from the Brotherhood, some not, but very, very badly treated. And I think that the radicalization inside Egyptian prisons is a big problem, and one that has to be looked at very seriously, and it poses a huge dilemma for the United States in its security and counterterrorism relationship with the government of Egypt.
Thank you. Actually, the next set of questions is directed at you, Michelle. There's and it's about these. They cover a whole range of countries in the Middle East. So one question says that you are arguing basically that democratization is a process that takes time, and we should give it time. But then, would you argue that we then should not protect civilians in Syria? Another question is about Saudi Arabia and the role of having a shift in the economic system. The point here being that what's happening in Saudi Arabia with the shift in the economic system is really a change in the contract between the state and citizens. It's an unwritten contract where services and so on are provided, and this is not provided to the same extent now. So how does this impact the process of change? There is a major question to everybody, but to you in particular, about the role of Al-Nahda in Tunisia. And there are 2 points of view in the questioning. One is, could we consider, or why don't we consider, learn from the Tunisian experience as an inspiring experience? No surprise, this question comes from the Tunisian embassy in Washington. And the other question is, can we really consider what's happening in Tunisia a real democratic change, or is it change in the procedural democratic surface, and that liberal and tolerant and multicultural values are not sufficiently there in that process? So this is a whole set that, if you don't mind addressing it.
Okay, so let me start with Tunisia first. Look, while Tunisia, I would say, is undergoing a genuine democratic transition, but it's still in process. It's by no means complete, and it could still fail or be reversed. It's fragile, it's young, and so forth. But I do think it's genuine, and if you go to Tunisia, as perhaps many of you have recently, you feel a tremendous change. And I think the place where you feel that most is in the expansion of freedoms of expression and freedoms of association. So this is not at all a case where you just have a change in the political system and elections are being held, but there's no real change in the overall climate of the society. I think there is a big change, and can be sometimes a bit painful is, in a way, now Tunisian society and civil society is outperforming government. The government and the system, with all due respect to our friends from the Tunisian embassy, but I mean, is that that civil society, I think, in Tunisia is performing, at a higher level. And so that means to me that the change is genuine. Regarding the role of Nahda in Tunisia, look, Tunisia, I think, and Tunisians and the Tunisian democratic transition has benefited tremendously from the fact that the Nahda movement has at its head a very sophisticated political philosopher in the person of Mr. Ghannouchi, and that I think he and others within the movement have been able to make compromises and work with others and so forth in ways that have been extremely important. So no doubt about that. Regarding what's happening in Saudi Arabia. There's a great article about this in the New York Times today, actually, that talks specifically about the social contract in Saudi Arabia and is it going to be changed. Look, it's still an open question. Those who know Saudi Arabia better than I do say that these ideas have been raised in the past, the kind of changes that are talked about, and they haven't actually happened. So the question is it really going to happen now, and these changes in the economy and so forth? And if so, what will that mean in terms of the relationship between the government and the citizens? But it's certainly extremely interesting to watch. I argued that democratization, if it happens at all, and again, I'm arguing that there's nothing that says that every country in the Middle East is somewhere on the spectrum between autocracy and democracy, and they all inevitably have to move toward democracy. That isn't necessarily the case, but there are some that I think may move in that direction. And saying that it's long and it's difficult and it has many phases and many waves and moves backwards and forwards and so forth, I'm not sure why one would take that to mean that we shouldn't protect civilians in Syria. I certainly would never look at the tragedy that has befallen Syria and Syrians and say, oh, well, it's just part of a long process of democratization. I don't view it that way at all, and I do think that the international community, including the United States, should have in the past and should now change its approach to Syria in a way that can really help to protect civilians and help to bring about an effective end to the conflict there.
Wonderful, thank you. There are not many questions about Iraq, but there are two major questions. One says that the Prime Minister, this is for you, Ustaz Abdulwahab, the Prime Minister of Iraq recently warned Turkey that its policies could lead to regional war. Are we headed in that direction of regional war? And the second is, do you think what's happening to the process of democratization in Iraq? Is it shelved or is it going backward?
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll start with the Prime Minister Abadi and his statue toward Erdogan. There was, many exchanges between the both parties. Actually, Turkey is not the only country which intervened in Iraq. Iraq is an open front from east, from west, from north. Everybody is there, either under the pretense of the international coalition against ISIS or on his own. Iran is on her own. I mean, Iran is everywhere in Iraq, in every corner in Iraq. Nobody say about intervention. Turkey came to Iraq, actually. Not now. There are many agreements between the Iraqi government and Turkey, paving the way for both the entities, both the countries, to go beyond the borders for a certain depth, 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, 15, it depends upon the situation. And for this, there was an agreement between Iraq and Turkey to bring about 500 people to train the Peshmerga on one hand and the Mosul tribes on the other hand. But this actually didn't got the liking of the Iranian-supported militias. And what we heard Abadi saying the other days is a resonance of what the militia commanders trying to express. And because of this, I brought out in my speech that the non-governmental actors, who are the ISIS on one hand and the Iranian-supported militias on the other hand, are the main hurdle of going toward a state of law in the country first, and establishing democracy on the representative basis. This is one. For the second question, I'm expecting that if many factors could be provided for, starting from cutting the Iranian intervention in Iraq, supporting the Iraqi society to come back to its original status, give one voice in a transparent way of ballot to every citizen, applicate what is written in the Constitution, that no parties soever could be established on a sectarian and religious basis, which are actually the ruling in the country now. So if we provide for these all, I think we can come again to reunite the Iraqi society on one hand, and reunite the Iraqi society on one hand, and reestablish a democratic regime on the other hand. The first thing to do is to reconsider what are the drawbacks of the present constitutions are. So All these, if we are taken in consideration, I think a new era could be emerged. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have a few questions to Peter. I'll summarize them as follows. One has to do with the Islamists. Are all Islamists basically the same? Do you go by that assumptions, or are there different? Are there moderate Islamists and other Islamists, and they are all the same? But I think one major question really has to do with what comes from inside the theory of democratization. Theory of democratization, when it talks about the Middle East, many people argue that the Middle East is not ready for democratization. You see where the direction is going because of the level of education and literacy levels and so on. What do you think about that? And the third question is about policy, about specific policies that you would recommend for the American administration, the new American administration, particularly in Syria.
Okay, I don't think this audience needs me to tell them that not all Islamists are the same. I mean, I think people here know that very well and better than I do. I think what's interesting is that a discourse has emerged on the American right, which conflates them all together. It was not so obvious during the Bush administration that this would be the case, because there was a wing inside the Bush administration, associated with people like Paul Wolfowitz and others, that wanted to see democracy take root, and might have been more open to the idea that for democracy to be possible, you had to allow Islamists to take part. But I think what's been interesting since the end of the Bush administration is the right has basically, in the United States, has moved towards a much kind of more realist right-wing view, much more like a Cheney view than you would say, a kind of a Bush or a Wolfowitz view, a total embrace of Sisi, who's become a hero worshipped on the American right, and basically a view that says anyone that we call Islamists basically shouldn't be allowed to run, and if that means there's no democracy, so who cares? They're probably not ready for it anyway. So in a kind of much more pessimistic kind of conservatism than the somewhat more kind of optimistic kind of hawkishness that you saw for a little period of time there in Bush's first term. On the question of whether the Middle East is ready for democracy, I mean, I'm not. There's a long scholarly debate about how tight the link between the development of a middle class and modernization theories and democracy is. Again, I'm not really qualified to get into the weeds on it. I would say that, and I think that again, the debate has gone back and forth based on world events. There was more optimism in the 1990s than there had been previously, and maybe a little bit less now. I think what's interesting is that the mood in the United States, I think, which I'm a little more qualified to talk about, has taken a much more pessimistic turn. That in a way, you have both at the kind of mass on the kind of right and the left in terms of the kind of a mass of American people. I think partly there's been a tremendous lack of faith in America's kind of internationalist, interventionist project more generally. I think to a really remarkable degree, both on the left, if you look at the kind of people who supported Bernie Sanders, and on the right, if you look at people like Donald Trump, these are people who are really fundamentally questioning whether basically being a superpower does any good for the average American, whether basically this whole project of trying to be the preeminent power in the world is actually really in the interest of the average American. And I think that larger shift, that larger kind of lack of faith in the very idea that the internationalist project, which is pushed by elites, actually is serving the welfare of ordinary Americans, which you're seeing very strongly in insurgencies on both the left and the right, I think has big implications for the way America views this question about, is the Middle East ready for democracy or not? Essentially, you have to be concerned about whether the Middle East is ready for democracy or not. You first of all have to kind of take the assumption that what happens in the Middle East should really matter to the United States at all. And I think that is being challenged in a kind of pretty fundamental way. And we saw that challenge to some degree in the 1990s, but we're seeing it more fundamentally today than we did then. And I think that's going to be we now have a kind of Republican Party foreign policy class that has been which is very internationalist and interventionist, extremist, which is geared up for a new Cold War with Russia, which has been totally repudiated by its own voters, basically has no basis at all. And on the Democratic side, a kind of liberal hawk foreign policy class, that Hillary Clinton is connected to, which again, I think has very, very little support among the actual supporters. So I think that's something to keep an eye out for. I'll stop there. Wonderful.
Please join me in thanking the panelists, and I have an announcement to make after we thank them. Thank you very much. So we are now going to be moving into the lunch conversation with Francis Fukuyama and Nader Hashemi. And this is going to be just next door in the Salon FG. So we'll see you there.
Thank you. يعطيك العافية.
أهلين، يعطيك العافية.